Well, it is an honour to be invited to speak at this international conference on vernacular architecture as representative of the UK Vernacular Architecture Group. The UK Vernacular Architecture Group promotes the study of buildings across Britain. Can we put the slide on? Sorry. So the UK Vernacular Architecture Group promotes the study of buildings across Britain and internationally. Our journal, Vernacular Architecture, welcomes contributions from scholars working in Britain and Ireland and on vernacular architecture elsewhere in the world. I hesitated to make this joke, but Denish has been so enthusiastic about the British so far, I'm going to say it anyway. The VAG is the BBC of vernacular architecture. We are actively developing the journal, Vernacular Architecture, to become more international while remaining an important venue for research on traditional buildings in Britain. The Vernacular Architecture Group uses the term traditional buildings, which gets away from both vernacular and architecture, as a way of defining our subject. And the group is primarily interested in studying buildings as they developed historically. The group hasn't generally engaged with conservation issues or policy. I'm not an architect. My training is in social history and historical archaeology, and I approach the subject really as an archaeologist, interested in what buildings can tell us about human culture. It's a privilege, I want to say, for me as a native English speaker, that this conference is being conducted in English. If we'd been doing this 500 years ago, we might have been speaking in Latin, where even thinking about the ways of the vernacular people wouldn't really have come to the minds often of educated Europeans. I also want to emphasise that not everyone in Britain speaks English as a first language, and English historically is not always the dominant language in every community. My own family are Welsh speakers. Cornish, Scots, Gaelic and the Manx language on the Isle of Man are other vernacular languages. And that is only to emphasise the settled nations. Gypsies have been a part of Britain since the 16th century, and many tongues were spoken in port towns. My talk will focus on the settled inhabitants of England and Wales, with some mention of Scotland and the Isle of Man. I am not talking about Ireland, which is a subject best left at the door of Irish scholars. I do include in my own research the subject of English and Welsh settlement outside Britain, especially in North America, but there is not time to go into that today. So the Vernacular Architecture Group was founded in 1953 and very much founded as a group. The founders were mainly Marxists and were committed to the study of ordinary people's lives. Interestingly, the VAF in the States, which will follow, is a sister organisation to the VAG, whereas the elite architectural historians of Great Britain established themselves in 1956 as a chapter of the American Society of Architectural Historians, founded in 1940. So it's kind of interesting how the two versions of the subject have travelled across the Atlantic. The journal is not as old as the group. The 50th issue of the journal was in 2019, and together with Martin Cherry, who some of you may know because he's been very active in this part of the world about building preservation policy, Martin Cherry and I wrote an editorial for the 50th anniversary of the journal, and I recommend it if you want it as a resource in any way for at least the development of the subject as seen through the eyes of the VAG. Now, the first known use of the term in Britain is from an Anglican, i.e. a Church of England magazine, on a review of new designs for rebuilding, really, historic churches in the early 19th century. Unfortunately, we can't identify the author because it was an anonymous book review to be read by clerics, and he was probably a cleric, unless they called on an architect to write the review. We just don't know. I've tried researching this. It's not possible to find out. And it's worth quoting in full because it gets into the whole issue of the language metaphor for architecture. So the reviewer writes in 1839, till the present age there has been always one style, which was universally adopted with exceptions not worth mentioning. Architecture was like the language of the country, as there was only one style of building in use at a time, which underwent a progressive change as that language also did. An architect, therefore, had only one style to learn and could easily master its grammar and vocabulary. He could get an ear for it. There was no more danger of his jumbling the terms and idioms of two different styles than of an Englishman inadvertently talking French or Spanish. The living style he considered unquestionably the last, and the others obsolete, dead, and unworthy of notice. But the present age has no vernacular style of architecture, that is, no one style in which its ideas naturally flow and express themselves, and which is inseparably connected with its taste and feelings. Architecture has become a literature. We learn a number of styles as we do a number of dead languages. And certainly in Britain from the late 18th century, there is a plurality of architectural styles. People can choose from Gothic Revival, Egyptian, and so forth, as well as classical or Greek Revival. And in a sense, vernacular as understood by practicing architects is one of those choices. And it seems to me that's one theme in the history of vernacular architecture as practiced by architects, is that it's one choice for 19th and 20th century and indeed 21st century architects. So Pugin, famously in his apology for the revival of Christian architecture in England, where he's promoting the revival of medieval Gothic, he refers to the concept of natural architecture. He didn't use the language metaphor. And a very nice quote from Pugin is where he says, "In matters of ordinary use, i.e. everyday life, a man must go out of his way to make a bad thing. Hence, in some of the rural districts where workmen have not been poisoned by modern ideas, barns, sheds, etc. were built and framed until very lately on the true old principles with braces, knees, and the high pitch." Pugin influenced George Gilbert Scott, who Dennis mentioned, and Scott is always cited, 1857, as using the term vernacular architecture, though he also uses it in a derogatory context. The earlier use is actually 1839. There's not scope here to go into the Gothic Revival, except to say that it's very much a reaction against Georgian architecture. Pugin and Scott want to go back before Britain became a capitalist country. They want to go back to the medieval craft and pre-industrial community and to find virtue in that community. If we move on to the 20th century, there's a very interesting paradox between the interest in studying old buildings historically and, again, contemporary architects interested in the vernacular as a concept. And this seems to me, at least in the British context, is something which is actually under-researched. What was the relationship between architects and architectural criticism, particularly in the pages of the Architectural Review, where there's a lot of conversation about vernacular, i.e. new building appropriate to place, and at exactly the same moment, people who were working historically going around recording buildings and establishing the Vernacular Architecture Group as a meeting place for people interested in recording buildings. W.G. Hoskins is an important figure in certainly the study of England for this topic. Hoskins never joined the VAG, and I think he was quite impatient with the idea that what you really need to do was record every little element. But he did talk on BBC Radio about the need for a book on peasant building or vernacular architecture, but he said quite dismissively, call it what you like. I also think it is exactly the case that when the VAG was founded in 1953, it could easily have been called the Folk Architecture Group. And I think it's actually documented that the decision was to call it vernacular because of discomfort with Nazi Germany's use of the term Volk. And it cannot be overemphasized that in the post-1945 context and in the early 1950s, these mainly Marxist founders were determined to record buildings that were being lost in the towns and the countryside at a great pace. This photograph is of Durham, Durham Cathedral on the the right, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, among other things. But I want to point out this building on the left, the white building, which is called Dunelm House. It was built as the student union for the university, and it's connected across to the cathedral by a Le Corbusier-inspired bridge. The key thing about this building, which of course involved taking down historic buildings, some people were protesting about the demolition of old historic coaching inn on the site, but it's interesting that the architects of this building were thinking in terms of the concepts of the vernacular. So if you can see the white of the building, it's built with white concrete from the local cement works at the steel town of Consett. The white concrete, the shapes of the building are meant to echo the traditional roofscape of the city. So it's both a modernist building and a vernacular-inspired building, and subsequently, not at the time, but subsequently labelled brutalism. I've written an essay about this building because I was very actively involved in keeping it, and I'm very pleased to say the UK government has listed it after the university attempted to block that listing. It's now, of course, a heritage asset for the university, now that it is protected. Okay, so that's the 20th century context. I do want to just go all the way back to the origins, though, of learned people studying ordinary people's customs. And that seems to me is quite an important dynamic here, that the people who go around doing the recording in every sense of the buildings, of the culture, are often university-educated people studying local customs. And that's part of a wider movement in 17th century England known as antiquarianism. John Aubrey is perhaps the most famous individual. William Dugdale is perhaps the first person in England to study the building fabric itself as clues to the past. Dugdale studies the cathedrals and is interested for the first time in looking at the actual sequence of the building itself. Now, what's very rarely acknowledged, even on recent books on this topic of the emergence of English antiquarians, how this is a movement motivated by national pride. It's a very national impulse here. W.G. Hoskins recognised this in his essay, The Discovery of England. He talks of there being a sense of national excitement amongst folk, educated folk, in studying their own country. And that begins in the 16th century and develops apace in the 17th century. And it's no coincidence that people are excited and proud of English history at the same moment as England is embarking on an imperial dimension. And this is really important because in England there's a tradition of studying the local, which I believe is a way of not thinking about empire. There's a very intensive engagement with the local in the English historical tradition, which is arguably about not thinking about imperialism. It has to be said, in the 17th century, there wasn't very much interest at all in old buildings of a humble kind. That has to wait till the later 18th century and is, of course, a reaction to the Industrial Revolution when Wordsworth and others start to celebrate the English cottage. And then throughout the 19th century, through to now, the cottage, the yeoman farmhouse, the English manor house, all of these are celebrated as the best of Old England. And that really reaches a crescendo, actually, in the Victorian period. At the high watermark of imperialism, you've got people celebrating Old England, which is a quiet, locally focused world, seemingly untouched by industry and empire. So, one of the most important books to be published on this subject for England is Eric Mercer's synthesis of patterns in houses across England that he published in 1975. There was mention of the king in Romania. It's worth noting that this book was published by the Royal Commission on Historic Monuments of England. That commission was closed by the UK government not so long ago and absorbed into English Heritage or Historic England as the government agency. Apparently, it is said, the late Queen Elizabeth was very dismayed that this Royal Commission on England's buildings was closed. So it was a research institute for studying and recording buildings. And the publisher of this book was Her Majesty's Stationery Office. So the nature of the English crown has been part of, or the English state, if you like, has been part of the subject. However, Mercer chose this image for the cover, and for me this image actually throws up some of the problems of using the term vernacular for houses, because this is a very wealthy house. This is a member of what we call the parish gentry, a family who would likely to have links to the universities and the church and so forth. This is not a peasant house. It was surrounded by peasant houses, if we want to use that term, and it was a world away from the village paupers, the people who were poor in the village. Its name is Bexon Manor Breadcar, and we can document the wealth of this particular household. It's a good example of the change from a medieval hall house to what I would call an early modern house, and I'll show that change again in a later slide. And one of the features of that rebuilding, that change into an early modern house in the 17th century, was the use of initials, which are the married couple, W.E., the date often of marriage, and then the surname, G. And of course, one of the problems for our subjects, certainly in England, is the buildings that tend to survive are the wealthier inhabitants of each parish. To study humbler homes, we normally need to piece it together from much more fragmentary survival of buildings, and often actually archaeology, excavation, and indeed documentary research. We can't assume that the buildings that still stand are good evidence for the population as a whole. The hearth tax is an excellent source, and there's a wonderful project to publish the records for the hearth tax. And it's worth pointing out here that we've got images on the front cover of the Kent hearth tax of different types of chimneys being inserted into the traditional open hall. And this, like Bexon Manor, is what would originally have been an open hall house with a chimney inserted and a ceiling put across. I'll show that change again in a moment. So Eric Mercer's book was very important. Another very famous book is Ron Brunskill's Guide to Recording Buildings. And one of the things I like about Brunskill's wonderful handbook is that he recognises the social differences in the village. And you can see where his sympathies lie. The small house, the people of significance in the village, the human backbone of the nation. I love that phrase. Wales is an area that has received intensive research on vernacular architecture. Interestingly, the Royal Commission in Wales continues. The devolved Welsh Government maintains the Royal Commission for Historic Monuments in Wales. And Iarwerth Peat published The Welsh House in 1940, and Iarwerth Peat was actively involved in establishing the Folk Museum for Wales, and it uses the term folk museum, based on Scandinavian examples with reconstructed buildings taken from all around Wales and put in St Fagans. If you're ever anywhere near Cardiff, go to St Fagans, it's fantastic. The Royal Commission volume on Wales, parallel to the Mercer book, is Peter Smith's study of houses with the Welsh countryside from 1975. Okay, I won't go too deeply into this, but Pete sees the Welsh house as simple and direct, whereas Mercer saw the English house as reflecting a stratified society. On the Isle of Man, we have again a national folk museum at Craignish, where there's been an effort to preserve the Man traditions. And what I would like to suggest is that in Wales and the Isle of Man, it's much easier to celebrate a folk tradition, perhaps also the case in Scandinavian contexts and where we are today, where these are folk traditions that have been badly done to. It's more difficult to celebrate a nation with a more imperial history, I would argue. So what's very interesting about the English tradition of studying houses is that it's almost always locally focused. And this is brilliantly reflected in the title of these two books, Eric Mercer's late study, English Architecture, The Shropshire Experience, and J.T. Smith's book, English Houses, The Hertfordshire Evidence. So it's a local study that stands for the whole national experience. Just briefly to look at some of the edges of England, the Anglo-Scottish border has a tradition of defensive architecture, of tower houses, and what's illustrated here is what's known as a bassal house, which is a small fortified farmhouse. The livestock were protected on the ground floor, and the house is on the first floor, and you can withdraw the steps, and you can usually pour the contents of the fire or the piss pot through a chute here to anybody trying to set fire to the wooden door at the front. And that reflects a culture of feuding that was actively encouraged by the English and Scottish crowns along the border. We're familiar with this today, hybrid warfare. This is the state actively promoting agitation on an international frontier before unification of England with England with Scotland. This form of building, interestingly, carries on after the formal unification. There's a feuding culture that continues for 2-3 generations. The grander folk on the border also go through an interesting transition. They have their peel towers, and they also have their hall houses. This is a good example of a hall rebuilding a timber-framed hall, which engages in Renaissance architecture in the 17th century. This example I love because they rebuild the timber hall in stone in the 17th century, and we actually have here the firm evidence that the wife is involved. Thomas Middleton and Dorothy, his wife, builded this house, anno 1614. Okay, very quickly, just again to give a sense of an edge to England, there is a very, very strong regionalised architecture in the Welsh borders, very strong decorative tradition, quite different from many other parts of the country, cusping in the timber framing, and when the ceiling is inserted into the hall of these houses, that again maintains a decorative tradition. So just to show you a few examples of this phenomena, this is Church's Mansion, Nantwich, on the Welsh border, and if you're beginning to recognise the pattern, we've got what was an open hall in the middle, cross passage at the end of the hall, service kitchen end here, parlour end, chamber end here, and the ceiling has been put through the middle of what would have been an open hall. Again, highly decorative example, would have been an open hall in the middle, a ceiling put across, cross passage put through, chimneys inserted. This would be the high status end, the good rooms off the high end of the hall, the kitchens at the other end. These are Duncan James's photographs, and Duncan is an excellent historian of this part of the world for buildings. This is showing what would have been the frame to an open hall, which has subsequently become an attic when the ceiling has been put in, and it shows this fantastic cusping, the decoration of the medieval open hall. That regional tradition of decoration is also there in the ceilings that are put in this region. So Duncan James has done wonderful work on these particular types of ceiling, which he rightly argues maintains this decorative tradition. But as you can see, these are very wealthy houses. It's a very wealthy section of society. This isn't everybody in the village by any means. So just to summarise the change that characterises these houses in England and Wales, we have the open hall with the cross passage at the low end, service and low status rooms beyond the cross passage, the hearth in the middle of the floor, open hall, and then the high end, the solar or the chambers and the parlour off the high end of the hall. That medieval use of space is changed in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries to what historians would call the early modern period, a closure of the hall, ceilings and chimneys, altered social relations, segregated use of space. There's then a change again in the 18th century where buildings in Britain become very symmetrical, and I'm convinced by the argument that that's about disguising what's going on inside the house. You can no longer read the house from outside. It becomes a kind of mask socially. And Henry Glassy and others have argued that that's about a failure of human trust in a more capitalist society. And I find that argument generally compelling. So this is the Bredgar example, which is illustrated in the abstract for this conference, and we saw the drawing that was used as Mercer's cover. And it's an example of a Wealden house from southeast England where the original open hall has had a ceiling put in, a gable put on, projecting bay windows and a porch added, All of that is the early modern with the chimneys. One thing I would really emphasise about English houses is the prominence of the chimney. I've been noticing in Veszprém this morning, very small chimneys. Even in the Netherlands, very small chimneys. In England, the chimneys are huge. Right, I just want to emphasise one feature of this change, which is when the open hall is transformed by the insertion of the ceiling and the chimney, we have in some regions, not all, but in some regions we have what's called the lobby entry. So this is Matthew Johnson's version of this change, where the same house has been rebuilt with a chimney stack. And instead of the traditional cross passage, low and high ends, we have an entry which is fundamentally different. And you can either be taken into the house space of the living room, or you can be taken into the high status space of the parlour. And that must go together with changes in class relations. Very quickly, there are wonderful reconstruction drawings based on documents and recorded buildings in a book called People at Home by Nat Alcock. And they vividly demonstrate the changes in England in the 16th and 17th centuries. And it's fantastic, these reconstruction drawings by Pat Hughes, where every item in the inventory at death of these households is put back into the room. So this is a house which has had the chimney and the ceiling put in through what would originally have been the open hall area. This house is a very good example of one of the motivations for putting the ceiling in, which is it's more bedrooms upstairs, but it's also storage for commercial produce. And that's the cheese chamber. That's the cheese being stored, waiting to be sold on the open market. So this is a commercial enterprise, the farm. And this is an example in this village in Warwickshire of a house which is new built. It's not rebuilding the medieval form at all. It's departing from the medieval habits, and it's a new build of 1680 with a lobby entry. And you could either be taken into the house space, there's now a front door and a back door, or you could be taken into the special space of the parlour. This is rather a famous example of a surviving longhouse on Dartmoor, where the animals were kept in the winter period in this low end here, and the human habitation is here. But this house also goes through the early modern transition, so it gets a porch added and a stair turret added and chimneys and an upper floor, even though it retains the low-end byre, which is what it's celebrated for as a survival of a long house. And there's the urine channel draining away there. That would be a later entry. Originally, the animals and the humans would have shared the cross-passage entry. These examples, the one on the left is from W.D. Hoskins' famous book, The Making of the English Landscape. He chose that photograph to illustrate what he called the great rebuilding of rural England in this period. And the house on the right is one I've studied in Durham, built for John Kay and his wife, 1651. It's interesting here, the date and the initials is on the parlour fireplace, because he was the grieve, he was the collector of taxes in the village. So the other villagers would have come into his parlour and seen that marriage date inscription. Okay, very briefly, one of the things that happens as part of this development is stair outshuts. You get these little turrets added to create stairs up to the rooms on the first floor, over what would have been the open hall. And you also get projecting porches and projecting, as well as projecting stair turrets. And the point I want to make is that these are not just vernacular features, they're also part of elite architecture. And I don't think one is informing the other. I think they're both coming about at the same time. So a very formalised version of this would be Hardwick Hall, also has initials on the building for Bess of Hardwick, Elizabeth Shrewsbury, fantastic staircases, but also in less grand architecture, the stair is very, very important in English architecture, as is the chimney. And this is a fantastic example of hybridity. This is Burley House in Lincolnshire, built for Queen Elizabeth I, Secretary of State, Lord Burleigh, and he combines the architecture of the orders with chimneys. And I think that is a sort of uniquely English expression of a certain sort of hybridity in architecture. You couldn't call that vernacular, but perhaps you could. Okay, this is an example in Durham, just to make the point that you get these stair turrets on even quite plain farmhouses. Less plain, above what I would perhaps call a status threshold, you get these turrets expressing the architecture of the orders, but this wouldn't be grand trained architects, this would be master mason type architects. And this, I could talk at length about this building, this comes out of what was originally a farmhouse, as a longhouse. These buildings are also replacing what would have been peasant longhouses. So it's so interesting to hear about Hungary and Romania, which have the survival through to the 20th century of village houses. This is a medieval village green, just outside Durham City where I work. And there was so much wealth from the coal industry that all these houses are rebuilt as Georgian houses. And they're an expression of what I was talking about in the 18th century of symmetrical houses, where you can't tell from outside the high or low end. You can't tell the functions of the rooms from the form of the house. 200 years earlier, that would have been a peasant farmhouse with animals at one end, humans at the other. This is a slide from Henry Glass's book, which is generally about Virginia, but he closes the book with an image from Devon in England. And this is his image of a Georgian house where you can't read the functions of the building on the front of an older building. And as I say, the argument is that it's about issues of trust. Finally, not everywhere underwent this change. So there are regions in England where the lobby entry never emerged, the cross passage remains. This has been pointed out by a lot of scholars, but not usually explained. And the logic would be that the communities there don't undergo this same change in terms of needing to disguise what they're doing within the house somehow. There's more trust, more tradition, if you like. So that would seem a fitting place to end, that there were traditions persisting alongside changes, and changes which have often been seen as moving away from vernacular traditions. I'll stop there.